And I hit pause, right, whenever we take a
Yep.
break. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Malcolm. So once again, my name is Daniel Ehringer, Transitions of Care Pharmacist over at Baptist Health Louisville. I do have my email up here. I don't think it's included in your guys' slides. This is in the recording, but if you have any questions about any of the material that I present today or questions before your exam, feel free to reach out. So a little bit about me. So as Dr. Malcolm alluded to, I'm actually a graduate from here, Sullivan University College of Pharmacy. This was before they changed the name to add health sciences to the end of it. But graduated in 2017. Prior to graduating, I ended up proposing to my now wife, Adrienne. This is a picture of us when I proposed to her a year before graduation. We shortly got married about a month after. Upon graduating pharmacy school, I ended up going into retail pharmacy with Walmart. Still actually work there, but ended up taking on a staff pharmacist position at Clarksville, Indiana store, and then ended up moving up to a manager role at New Albany, Indiana, and then Scottsburg, Indiana. During that time I was with Walmart, my wife and I, we had two beautiful girls, Adelaide and Vivian. Vivian's the youngest on the left. She's 4, will be 5 in about a month. And then Adelaide is 6 in first grade. Mean the world to both my wife and I. During the time that I was, in retail pharmacy, I kind of wanted to get a little bit, felt like I wanted to do something a little bit different, something more meaningful. Ended up deciding to go and do residency after being in retail for about 4 or 5 years. So I ended up applying to IU Health and got accepted into their PGY1 program. The hospital I was at was in Lafayette, Indiana, Arnett Hospital. While I was there at IU, I ended up deciding that I wanted to do ambulatory care. So I applied to our PGY2 ambulatory care program here at Baptist Health Louisville, and ended up staying on as a transitions of care pharmacist where I am now. Some new things. So my wife and I ended up finding out about a month or 2 ago that we're expecting a boy due here in February. So it's super exciting. This is a picture of Adelaide and Vivian about a week ago. We just got back from Clearwater. That's why I'm so burnt and tan. But exciting news. Here's the objectives for the lecture today. I'm not going to go through all these, but I've already written all of the exam questions. Everything is tied to these objectives, so as long as you're able to answer all of these, you should be fine. All right, so general housekeeping. So there is a lot of information within this lecture. Like I said, focus on the biggest points of the big objectives. History is primarily for informational purposes. I'm not going to ask you which president did this or any of that. I'm not going to ask you to remember any dates of anything. I also use Poll Everywhere throughout the lecture, so feel free to go ahead and log in for that. The information is posted up there. And then, like Dr. Malcolm alluded to earlier, this information is really important. Regardless of wherever you practice, whether you go into retail pharmacy or hospital pharmacy, you will be exposed to all of this information, and it's really important to actually understand these concepts. All right, so starting off first, Poll Everywhere question. I always like to introduce it with asking, why do we actually need government in society? Seems like it's working. Yep. Order, safety, enforce. Yep. So I agree with some of these. There's a lot of different reasons why we would need government in our lives. I mean, just thinking of if we didn't have government, there would be tons of anarchy, no order whatsoever, no way to actually prevent things from happening, having safety issues. So this is a pretty large, slide, pretty busy. But basically, it's just kind of shows the Constitution of the United States and how we have different branches of government, legislative, executive, judicial. With the current administration, I'm sure a lot of things are changing. Some of this stuff might not be relevant, but the core pieces that we're mainly going to be like focusing on when it comes to like medication safety is two specific branches of government. One of them is the Department of Justice, and then the other is the Department of Health and Human Services. There is also one independent agency we will briefly discuss today called the FTC, or Federal Trade Commission. But these are just the two parts of the government that we actually associate when we think of like medication safety. All right. So if we wanted to basically, divide up the governmental structure when it comes to, who's involved with medication safety, this kind of just breaks it down and makes it a little bit more simplified. So we have federal government, we have state government. The federal government, has the Department of Health and Human Services. We have the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, like we just went over. Housed within the Health and Human Services, we have the Food and Drug Administration, and then we have the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And then housed within the Department of Justice, you have the DEA. With our state government, we have our governor, who appoints members of the Board of Pharmacy. And then we also have our state legislators that make the laws for the specific state. So if you guys had to guess, which organization out of all of these likely has the biggest role when it comes to medication safety? FDA, for sure. So I'd say about 60 to 70% of this lecture is all FDA. So one of the biggest ones. So we'll start talking about that now. So the FDA, as we know it now, has not always been what it is. It actually started in 1862. What they ended up finding was like states, when it came to like foods and drugs, they had a lot of variability when it came to how they basically managed adulteration and misbranding of our foods and drugs. And so there was concern about that, and President Abraham Lincoln appointed a chemist and created the Bureau of Chemistry to basically investigate adulteration and misbranding of our food and drugs. Over that time, between 1862 and the early 1900s, there was a lot of investigation into this, and they ended up finding that there was a lot of evidence of adulteration and misbranding happening. And then I'm sure you guys have heard of the novel by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, which talked about the meat packing industry, and that led to a bunch of public outrage. But basically between that time and when that novel released, there was over 100 bills that was introduced to Congress. None of them ended up getting passed. And then finally, once that novel came out, it ended up leading to the Pure Food and Drugs Act that we have, that basically prevented adulteration and misbranding. And then later in 1927, the Bureau of Chemistry ended up dividing out into two separate divisions. We had the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, which did a lot of the regulatory functions that the Bureau of Chemistry did. And then they had the Bureau of Chemistry and Soils, which was the non-regulatory research. And then in 1930, they basically took away the I for insecticide and just shortened it to FDA. So another history lesson. Basically all of these are just a bunch of different acts or amendments that ended up happening as a result of specific tragedies or issues that occurred in the past. So I'm sure you guys might have heard of the sulfanilamide tragedy, but it was a drug that was used to treat streptococcal infections. Primarily came in like a tablet form, and there was a huge demand for a liquid formulation for children. And so they ended up finding that the manufacturer of this drug, the chemist, ended up finding that it dissolved really well in diethylene glycol, which is antifreeze. The chemist ended up, formulating the product. They got the flavor and everything correct, but he failed to mention that the bottles that they basically manufactured contain antifreeze, which is a poison. It ended up getting shipped throughout the country and killed over 100 children, I believe. And that ended up leading to the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which basically required more safety regulations before a drug could be brought to market. And then in 1962, the Kefauver-Harris amendments was the result of the thalidomide tragedy, which basically was a sleeping pill that was marketed in Europe that led to birth defects in children. And as you can see, basically they would come out with like limbs that were missing. And as a result of that, this required more safety studies to be done, as well as efficacy being required. And then lastly, you had your medical device amendments, which was basically allowed the FDA to also regulate medical devices as the result of there was these intrauterine devices specifically that caused, it was over like 100,000 women got hurt from the specific intrauterine device, ended up leading to that specific amendment to allow them to regulate that market as well. So do you notice a trend? Basically, there's usually a lot of these specific laws and acts are the result of some kind of tragedy or some kind of issue. And that's why sometimes it is kind of important to have government involvement to prevent, things like this and tragedies from happening. All right. So when we think of the FDA's mission, they're responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of drugs, biologics, and medical devices. And they ensure safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. They also regulate our tobacco market, specifically with manufacturing, marketing, and distribution. They also help with advancing our public health. They help get accurate public information, specifically on scientific studies for medical products and foods. And they also play a role in our nation's counterterrorism capability. So like we have stockpiles of like antibiotics in the event we have like a bioterrorism event. So for the FDA, this is a kind of an organizational structure of how the FDA is. Oop.
Do you need a charger?
I have a plug in. I need to move it over here. Hold on 1 second. All right, so the FDA structure, basically, again, this is a really busy slide. Biggest thing we want to just take away from this is we have two specific divisions where the FDA is involved with medication safety, and that includes our Centers for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and then we have the Drug Evaluation and Research Division as well. So why do we have two separate divisions? Where did this come from? What do they do? So CDER, which is the acronym that we will refer to them as, they're responsible for looking at our naturally or chemically synthesized substances. But this excludes things like vaccines and allergenics. They also look at hormone products like insulin. CBER, or the Biologics Division, focuses on vaccines, allergenic products, blood or human blood-derived products, immunoglobulin products, any products with intact cells or microorganisms, proteins, peptides, carbohydrates, animal venoms. So why, again, do we have two divisions? What's the reason behind all of this? So we have a horse here. His name was Jim. So he, specifically when we think of back in the day, infections were a lot more common than they are now, specifically because we have vaccines to help protect us. Back then, they actually, diphtheria was a pretty common illness that would occur, specifically in like children. And this was before the Tdap vaccine. Do you guys know what's in Tdap vaccine? Okay, tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis. So diphtheria was a common illness that would occur in children. And so a way to basically, cure the illness is they would inject horses with the specific toxin with diphtheria. They would then the horse's body would generate antibodies or antitoxin to the toxin. And then they would then purify the blood and then inject it into humans. 13 children, as a result of this, ended up dying because the horse ended up having tetanus. And so this led to the Biologics Control Act of 1902. So another thing to also think about is when it comes to like biologics, they're a lot more complex molecules. It's not something that you could easily just throw in like a mass spectrometer or an NMR machine and be able to determine what it looks like as far as the structure. And so a lot of these specific biologics are very complex and ultimately depend on the manufacturing process to make sure you get it right every single time. And there's also a huge biotechnology revolution in medicine where we have monoclonal antibodies and other types of pretty complex molecules being created with cancer therapies, RA treatments, as well as vaccines. So FDA's role in pharmacy. So this kind of just oversees everything that we're going to kind of discuss. But prescription drugs and biologics, they oversee our drug approval, drug labeling process, safety post-approval, which includes our MedWatch at VAERS, the REMS programs, drug recalls. They also regulate our non-prescription drugs with our NDA and OTC monograph process, and then the OTC drug label. And then lastly, with dissemination of information with advertisements and specifically drug information. So this will probably be a review for you guys, but when we think of like the drug approval process, this kind of just oversees like what, basically the overarching like how it comes to be. So we usually start out with animals being tested with the drug to make sure it's safe to be used in humans. Based on those specific studies that they do with the animals, they then submit what's called an IND or investigational new drug application, which basically the FDA reviews to determine is it safe to begin starting clinical trials in humans. We then do the clinical trial phase, which consists of phases 1 through 3. During that time, they're also having like a review meeting with the FDA, where the FDA will tell them like, is there anything, or give them insight into what things they want to actually see, any issues that they see with their study designs, give the manufacturer feedback before they submit what's called the NDA or the new drug application. So NDAs are pretty massive when it comes to the amount of documents involved in that application, usually about 100,000 or so pages of information that come from these trials that are done. And then the FDA reviews that and gives them the go-ahead to begin the labeling process, which we'll discuss here in a little bit. They then do a factory inspection of the facility that's going to be manufacturing the drug, and then they're granted FDA approval. After FDA approval, the drugs then go into what's called the surveillance or phase 4 phase to basically look and see is there any other side effects or issues that are identified after the drug is approved. So going into phases of clinical trials, starting with phase 1, this primarily emphasizes safety, and it includes a really small population of patients, usually about 20 to 80. And they're looking specifically for common side effects, metabolism, and excretion of the drug. So looking at pharmacokinetic data. In phase 2, this is going to start getting a larger population of patients, so hundreds of participants. And their primary emphasis is effectiveness, to make sure the drug is effective. They're going to use it in a specific disease or condition. And they're going to continue to evaluate the safety and short-term side effects. Phase 3 is going to be your largest, so it's going to include thousands of participants. And it gathers more information on safety and effectiveness. And they study different populations, different doses. They use the drug in combination with other drugs. And then lastly, our phase 4, which we talked about as the post-marketing phase, specifically called the post-marketing monitoring stage, where the manufacturer is submitting periodic safety updates to the FDA. And the FDA monitors this safety post-approval to basically look for serious unexpected adverse events that might not have been discovered in the first 3 phases. Any questions on any of that so far? Probably a review, I would say. All right, so faster approvals. I don't know if you guys are aware of this stuff. So a lot of students tend to get tripped up on this section, and we have done test questions on this section, so definitely I would make sure you understand it. But one thing I wanted to point out before we get into all of it is drugs can have multiple different types of fast approvals. So we're going to go through what's called like breakthrough therapy, priority review, fast track. They can have all 3, they can have all 4. But if I'm going to ask you a question on it, I'm going to give you like a pretty specific example, and it's going to be pretty clear which one I'm talking about. So first one we're going to talk about, breakthrough therapy. It's designed to expedite the development and review of drugs that are intended to treat a serious condition for which preliminary clinical evidence indicates the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapy. So preliminary evidence should show a clear advantage of this new drug, and it requires some kind of clinically significant endpoint. So it can improve morbidity or mortality or symptoms of the disease. Priority review, just a slightly different concept. So what the FDA does is it directs its overall attention and resources for specific drugs that have significant improvements in safety, effectiveness, diagnosis, or prevention of serious conditions. And what they do is they end up taking a smaller amount of time, they devote more resources to approve the drug. So instead of what we would typically see for a standard review of an NDA being about 10 months, they shorten that to about 6 months. So it just goes a lot faster. The accelerated approval program allows for earlier approval of drugs that treat serious conditions or diseases, and meaningful clinical endpoints can take many years. So they use what's called a surrogate endpoint. Examples include things like chemotherapy agents. So we think about like what would be a clinical meaningful endpoint for cancer therapies. You would want to know like, well, how long is the patient going to live with the cancer? Well, think of how long that might take. It might take many years to figure that out. Whereas you could just look and see, like, is it shrinking the tumors? We could use that as what's called a surrogate endpoint to determine, will this actually be, is it useful and effective? And then we also have like antiretrovirals for HIV. So those were approved based off of increasing CD4 count. Whereas clinical meaningful endpoint, how long does a patient live on this drug for HIV or prevents them from getting AIDS? Could take a whole lifetime. So fast track program. So this reduces the time for the FDA's review of drugs to treat serious or life-threatening diseases for those that have the potential to address an unmet medical need. So the drug sponsors submit portions of the application as information becomes available, what's called a rolling submission. So what this is basically saying is as like the phases of clinical trials are being done, so you have your phases 1, 2, and 3 that are happening, the manufacturer is able to submit the data from all of those trials all at once, going into the NDA to the FDA as that information is coming out. Instead of everything getting available, sending them 100,000 documents, they're able to review it as the information is coming in. Just speeds up the process. The big example that you probably could think in most recent times that used the fast track program is the COVID vaccine. Bless you. So a lot of people, when the COVID vaccine came out, I remember when I was in retail pharmacy, a lot of patients were really hesitant given how fast the vaccine got approved. But a lot of people didn't actually know that studies on mRNA-based vaccines actually started a couple decades earlier, specifically with other coronaviruses, and then also the Middle Eastern specific virus that occurred, MERS. Moderna had done RNA-based, trial vaccines. And then once the COVID-19 spike protein was sequenced, they were able to create the mRNA vaccine a lot quicker using that specific technology. And they were submitting portions of the phases 1 through 3 clinical trials as it became available, which allowed for it to become approved within that year. Another example of this is kind of a unique one, but this is what's called the animal rule pathway. And it was specifically developed for the anthrax vaccine. But what it does is that it allowed for licensures of a vaccine that basically where you couldn't do like an efficacy study like on a human, it wouldn't be considered like ethical because you wouldn't like infect somebody with anthrax and then try to treat them with the vaccine. So what they basically did was they allowed just use of studies on animals to allow for approval of the specific anthrax vaccine. But it's a last resort when no other mechanism is possible. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So expanded access. This is another type of concept, but it's referred to, sometimes you might hear it called compassionate use. But it's a pathway for a patient to get some type of investigational drug when they have like a life-threatening disease or condition, so they can get access to it. It can be a drug, biologic, medical device, but it's appropriate when a patient has all of these specific conditions. So they have some type of serious or life-threatening condition, no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy is available, enrollment in a clinical trial is not possible, the benefit justifies the risk of treatment, and investigational medical product will not interfere with trials that are being done currently for market approval. An example of this that, like when I was at IU, patients that have like cancer, like in our on my oncology rotation, they would be like, they have tried every single chemotherapy option that's currently available. The cancer's still progressing. And so they would get access to an investigational drug that's still not even marketed yet, and be able to, try that as a last resort. So that would be like an example. All right, next poll everywhere question. So which FDA expedited approval process is intended to speed up the development and review of drugs that treat a serious condition for which there is substantial improvement over available therapy? Looks like most of you got it right. So yes, it is D, breakthrough therapy. With like accelerated approval program, what would be an example, I guess, like what would be like a specific situation where we would use something like that? Someone give me an example. What defers it? Yeah, so any kind of like, you would use like a surrogate endpoint to speed up the development. So we kind of talked about like cancer with chemotherapy and tumor shrinkage. Antiretrovirals is another one. All right, so vaccines and biologics. So this is basically the drug approval process, but with vaccines and biologics. So if you look at it, it looks very similar to the previous slide on this. Only difference, as you can see, is we have manufacturing and factory inspections that are occurring while clinical trials are being done. Another difference is just the naming of the type of application. Instead of NDA, it's BLA or Biologics License Application. So we're going to start talking about the manufacturing process. So while vaccines and biologics are being tested, the FDA is assessing information pertaining to the manufacturing process and facility. And they're looking for specifically the facility, evaluating and making sure that it's, safe, sterile, and they're following specific compliance standards. Another thing is the manufacturers are required to submit to the FDA for each batch or lot, and that is to ensure that we're demonstrating lot-to-lot consistency. And if you guys recall, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but with biologics, a lot of them are very complex molecules. They're defined by the manufacturing process. And so the FDA is basically overseeing their process, developing a protocol, making sure that each lot comes out almost exactly the same every single time. And so they're working with the manufacturer to develop what's called a lot release protocol. And it's a template of tests to be conducted on each lot that will be used post-approval of the drug. And then once the vaccine or biologic is able to be reliably produced and consistent, they then submit what's called a biologic license application, or BLA. And it's essentially identical to an NDA, but also requires the details of the manufacturing process and the facilities that are going to be making that biologic or vaccine. And then once that specific vaccine or biologic is approved, the manufacturers are required to submit results and samples of each lot to the FDA. And the results of the testing submitted to the FDA includes assessment of purity, potency, identity, and sterility. And the FDA performs confirmatory testing on those submitted samples. And the manufacturer is not permitted to distribute a specific lot of a vaccine or biologic until the FDA releases it. So I don't know if any of you have worked in like retail pharmacy, but like if you can recall, almost every flu season when the high dose flu shot comes out, we get a bunch of it and then it goes out and it takes a while to get it back in stock, like a couple weeks or so. Result is likely because of this. So they have to submit, those samples of the high dose flu shot to the FDA. They have to review it, make sure it's safe, everything checks out. So that's why it can take a little bit of time. All right. So the next section we're going to talk about is labeling. So this is for biologics, vaccines, and drugs. So when you guys think of labeling, you're probably thinking like, well, that's probably the container label, which I have the definitions of each of these here. But a label is a display of a written, printed, or graphic matter upon an immediate container of an article. So the example is a container label. Labeling is all labels and other written, printed, or graphic matters upon any article, or its containers or wrappers, or accompanying the article. I know that sounds like pretty crazy, the definition, but basically it means the container label and then any other documents that go with it. So that includes like the FDA approved patient labeling and prescribing information. So all the different types of labeling, specifically FDA approved drug labeling, include the container label, medication guides, patient package inserts, instructions for use, and prescribing information. Specifically, the medication guide, patient package insert, and the instructions for use, those are what's called patient-specific labeling, so they're targeted for patients only. So the container label, this is straight from the FDA's website, and I apologize for the typos within this. I can't believe the FDA would do that, but anyways, this is like something that the FDA gives to the manufacturers when they're like developing a container label as far as like how they want the label to look. So that's why all the labels that you see on specific bottles follow the same formatting. So you got like your NDC at the top, you got your brand name, generic in the parentheses, et cetera, et cetera. I do have something also marked new down here on the corner. So you guys might have started noticing that we have like QR looking codes, which is a 2D matrix barcode with now like an NDC serial number, expiration of lot. We'll talk about that here in a second, but that's a result of a new act that just started going into effect. We then have medication guides. So these are paper handouts that are required to be provided to patients for many prescription medications to address issues that are specific to particular drugs and drug classes. And they contain FDA-approved information that can help a patient avoid a serious adverse event. So examples of drugs where you have to basically give these medication guides out are like your antidepressants, ADHD medications, opioids, antidiabetics. If you ever worked in retail, I'm sure you know, like whenever you're about to check somebody out, all these pages print off. That's what this is. This is the medication guides that are being printed off. And the FDA requires these guides to be distributed if they determine that certain information is necessary to prevent a serious adverse effect, if a known serious side effect exists that should involve patient decision making, and then lastly, if the patient's adherence to the directions for use are essential for its effectiveness. Then again, I have just kind of a guide from the FDA as far as how it should look as far as structure. All right, patient package insert. So this is labeling that is required to be dispensed with specific products or classes of products. Specifically, the only two that it's required to be given with is the oral contraceptives and estrogen-containing products, mainly to talk about the CV risk associated with use of estrogen products. And it ensures that the patients are fully informed of the risks and benefits involved with use. And the patient package inserts, so manufacturers can submit patient package inserts voluntarily, but their distribution is actually not mandated by the FDA. Only the estrogen-containing products where it's actually required. So instructions for use is pretty self-explanatory, but it's labeling that's dispensed for specific products where self-administration can be complicated. And it includes drugs that require like multiple steps to prepare, administer, store, or dispose. So some examples that you could probably think of are like your inhalers or insulin, where there's a bunch of steps involved to, take the dose of the drug. And it's intended to give directions that are clear and understandable to patients to promote safe and effective use of the drug. However, distribution is actually not mandated. Prescribing information. So this is your specific drug labeling that is written for healthcare providers. It has to contain a summary of essential scientific information that's needed for safe and effective use of drugs and biological products. It has to be informative and accurate, and it can't be promotional in tone nor false or misleading. And then it has to be updated when new information becomes available. So if they find a new side effect or some kind of adverse effect that occurs, any kind of new studies that are done on it, it has to be updated within the prescribing information. I'm sure you guys have probably seen when you get like bottles of drugs from like the distributor, come with these huge pieces of paper. That's what this is. It's the prescribing information. Doesn't have to go out to the patient. It's not patient information. But it's just a resource for you to use, like if you wanted to review how it's stored, studies that have been done, typical dosing, etc. So this is kind of what it looks like. This is obviously a lot more condensed than what obviously this is. But you got like your boxed warning, which we'll talk about here in a second. Tons of other information that is necessary like for a prescriber or pharmacist. And then, like I mentioned, you have to also make sure that you're looking at the most up-to-date revision of the specific prescribing information, and these periodically do get updated. So I have some examples here. I don't know if we have time to actually go through all of these, but I just wanted to give you guys some examples for the future if you wanted to look and see like what specific drug labeling looks like. So I have like Brio, Yasmin, and venlafaxine. So just thought that might be interesting for you guys to see. All right, so box warning. So you guys might hear this referred to as commonly the black box warning, but it's issued by the FDA and it's featured in the labeling of drugs associated with serious adverse reactions. It's most commonly discovered in your post-market surveillance or phase 4. And the warnings are also issued to draw attention to the dosing, monitoring requirements, and potential drug interactions. So the example I have here is ciprofloxacin, which is a fluoroquinolone. You guys might have heard of it causing like tendon rupture as a possible like side effect, which is included in the black box warning. How often do you guys feel like that occurs? Do you think that would have been discovered in phases 1, 2, or 3? So how many participants are in like phases 3 or phase 3? Thousands. Okay. So tendon rupture, I think it was like, I was reading, it was like 2 cases out of every like 10,000 or something like that, primarily in elderly. So add that factor on top of 2 every 10,000. So that's why you end up typically discovering these in like your phase 4. Some other examples, like carbamazepine. Have you guys ever heard of the HLA-1502 gene, carbamazepine? Well, you will eventually, but it's a specific gene that is commonly associated or found in Han Chinese individuals. And specifically, if they carry this gene, their body reacts to the drug and causes what's called Stevens-Johnson syndrome and TEN, or toxic epidermal necrolysis, and cause their skin to basically just slough off. And that was found, again, once it got approved, they started discovering that this was happening more in Han Chinese people. So it now requires genetic testing in those that have that are of Han Chinese origin. So something super random that only would have been discovered in post-marketing. All right, so which FDA-approved drug labeling is primarily directed towards healthcare providers? Good job. Yep, prescribing information. All right. Any questions before we move on? Okay. So the next part, this is the new thing that I was talking about. So it's called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or DSCSA. It was originally signed into law in 2013. And the primary goal of this is to prevent counterfeit, stolen, or contaminated or otherwise harmful drugs from entering the U.S. pharmaceutical chain. And legislation was implemented in stages over a 10-year period, and they initially required implementation by November of last year. When I gave the lecture last year, I thought it was going to be in effect, but then I started reviewing again. Evidently, it got pushed back again because there was a lot of challenges as far as like getting it implemented, and we'll talk about like why, because there's a lot of different factors involved with how you regulate all of this. But ended up getting pushed back, and I had the different dates as far as like when it was required. But hopefully everybody should be on board by November of this year. Specifically the larger dispensers, I'm assuming like mail order pharmacies, they have until November. So the major provisions of the DSCSA is it requires product identification or serialization, product tracing, verification, detection and response, notification, and standards for licensure for specifically distributors and third-party logistics providers. So product identification. So this requires manufacturers and repackagers to utilize product identifiers on prescription drug packages. Specifically for product identifiers, it requires a standard numerical identifier, including an NDC, which has always been present on drugs. However, the big new one that is now required is what's called a serial number that's alphanumeric. So if you look, I don't know if this actually works. Let's see here. Cool. Right here, where it says serial number. So this specific product, you can trace it to the individual bottle. So I'm going to pass this around if you guys wanted to see, but basically what it allows you to do is you can trace, like this specific Zofran bottle, you could trace it. That specific one, whereas previously you could only trace specific lots of a drug. Now if something enters into the supply chain and that's not able to be traced to that individual bottle, it could be potentially like counterfeit, and it's easier to trace. Other things that are required on the specific labeling is the lot number as well as the expiration date. And the product identifier data has to be in both human and machine readable formats. Requires utilization of what's called a 2D matrix, data matrix barcode. So that's what's pictured here is that matrix barcode, but then you also have the information that can be readable by a human. So you have to have both. So the product tracing aspect, basically from manufacturer to dispenser, and this is what's been causing a lot of the delays is this part. So basically it requires an exchange of information with each transaction regarding a drug product and who handled it. It contains 3 different components. So you have your transaction information, your transaction history, and your transaction statement. All of these 3 collectively are what's called T3. So your transaction information includes things like the name, strength, dosage form, NDC container size, the number of containers purchased, lot numbers, transaction date, shipment date, name and address of the previous owners and purchaser. So all that's in the TI. Your history is a statement that includes information of each prior transaction for a product back to the manufacturer. So if it goes from the manufacturer to a distributor to a pharmacy, you'd be able to see all the different histories of where it went. And then you have your statement, which is basically an attestation by the entity transferring ownership that it has complied with all requirements. So the product verification component, basically systems and processes shall be established to comply with verification requirements to ensure drug packages are legitimate and unaltered. And all trading partners have to be able to verify a suspect or illegitimate product identifier upon request from a trading partner, federal agency, or state agency. And they have to be able to submit a request for verification from a trading partner. So when responding to requests for information, the trading partners have to be able to provide the T3 in a reasonable time frame. So they have the manufacturers, distributors, and repackagers. They have 1 business day, not exceeding 48 hours, whereas dispensers like pharmacies, they have 2 business days or as determined by the FDA. And your T3 documentation has to be retained for 6 years. So detection, response, and notification. So if a trading partner identifies a product as suspect, they're required to quarantine and investigate the product to determine if it is illegitimate. So that includes verifying or validating the applicable TI and TH. So when I say what is a suspect product, so if you believe that it's potentially counterfeit, diverted, stolen, or subject to a fraudulent transaction, intentionally adulterated, or otherwise unfit for distribution. And if there is credible evidence that the product is any of the above, it becomes illegitimate. And then if determined illegitimate after verifying your T3, all trading partners and the FDA must be notified within 24 hours. So big new thing that started to enter like retail pharmacy world. So definitely important to know, specifically like at like Walmart. I'm not like signing documents or anything like that, but we do have like, we use McKesson, which is like our primary distributor. They have like all of our reports there on McKesson's website. We can just pull them if we need to. But definitely important to know in the event that you have like a state agent or some kind of FDA individual that comes in asking for it. All right, so MedWatch. So this is FDA's voluntary system for monitoring adverse events for drugs specifically during phase 4. It can be submitted via online at fda.com or fda.gov/medwatch or by telephone or fax. And then when new risks are uncovered, they get added to the drugs labeling. The public is informed via letters, public health advisories, or other education. And in rare cases, drugs can be withdrawn from the market. So there have been instances where specific adverse events are discovered later, and they end up determining that it's not safe, and it gets pulled from the market. And there is like a list if you go like search Google, and you can just put like drugs pulled off the market in post-surveillance phase. There's a large list. So it does happen. Yeah. Yeah, and people are encouraged to. Yeah. So his question was, are you? You said, are you required to submit, or anybody can submit? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Anybody can. Yeah. Whether it's a normal patient or a pharmacist or a doctor. Yep. Yep. So the best system. This is specifically the same thing as MedWatch, but it's for biologic products. Difference between this one is it uses real-world health data from multiple electronic health sources and provides evidence for regulatory decisions. So they use like your EHRs, administrative claims. They also collaborate with multiple partner organizations to provide access to healthcare data and scientific expertise. We also have VAERS, so this is specifically for our vaccines. Basically, VAERS stands for Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. It's a vaccine safety surveillance program that's co-monitored by the FDA and CDC. And they're specifically looking for adverse events or side effects that occur after use of a vaccine. But FDA and CDC, they're going to jointly monitor the VAERS reports, looking for unexpected patterns or changes in adverse events. So one of the more recent ones that I can think of when it comes to use of like VAERS was the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine. When it came out, they ended up finding that it caused cerebral venous sinus thrombosis and thrombocytopenia, specifically in like younger women. And they started seeing like cases of this start to pop up as a result of like VAERS submissions, and it ended up getting pulled off the shelves and recalled. But just kind of goes to show like how voluntary submission and things like this can actually lead to, important safety things being discovered. So VSafe, this was originally launched in December of 2020 during the COVID pandemic, and later expanded to include our monkeypox and RSV vaccines. This one is specifically monitored by the CDC. I would put this in the CDC section, but I thought it kind of worked well with VAERS like right after. But it provides personalized and confidential health check-ins. Initially, when it was launched for the COVID vaccine and the monkeypox, this specific data, they ended up having over 10 million participants, 151 million health surveys, and the data was included in 20 scientific publications. It was taken down at one point, but then reintroduced, and it's used specifically now for the COVID-19 and RSV vaccines. But basically, the patient enrolls in this. They get weekly health check-ins, basically checking in how you're doing after you get the vaccine. And then that information gets submitted. The CDC monitors it. And if there's any issues identified, that could lead to something potentially happening, like a drug getting or a vaccine getting pulled. All right, I think I'm gonna take a break.
Yeah.
Take a, was it 10-minute break?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he also has that study guide on blindfold and has the answer key too.
All right, so we're gonna get started again. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what's called the REMS program with the FDA. So the FDA Amendments Act of 2007 basically gave the FDA authority to require what's called the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy, or REMS, from drug manufacturers. And what these are designed to do is to reinforce medication use behaviors and actions that support the safe use of that medication. So they're focusing on preventing, monitoring, and or managing a specific risk by informing, educating, and reinforcing actions to reduce frequency and severity of the event. So an example that you guys might all be aware of if you've worked in retail is what's called iPledge, which is the REMS program for drugs that contain isotretinoin, which is a product that's used for nodular acne that was found to end up causing teratogenic effects in exposed fetuses. And the goals of this particular REMS program was to prevent fetal exposure to isotretinoin, informing prescribers, pharmacists, and patients about the serious risks and safe use conditions, And it outlines several requirements, including documentation of a negative pregnancy test with each fill. Used to require patients to actually go to like the provider's office or a clinic to get a pregnancy test every single time for every month. Now they actually require, I believe you can do at-home tests, which is great. Also education on the risks of isotretinoin, and then the documentation of the patient's contraception method. Another example of like a RIMS program that I can think of is a drug called Camzyos or mavacamten. It's used for what's called HOCM or hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. But that specific drug can cause heart failure and requires periodic echocardiograms. It also is a CYP3A4 metabolite, so tons of drug interactions, and they require drug interaction reports to be done with each fill of the drug. So just some examples. Drug recalls. So a drug recall is a voluntary action, which seems kind of interesting to me. You would think that a drug recall would be involuntary, but the FDA basically just oversees the manufacturer's recall strategy. So it's taken by the drug manufacturer to remove a defective product from the market. And they can be conducted on the company's own initiative. And in some cases that are rare, the FDA can actually require a drug recall, but it doesn't happen as often. And basically, like I said, the FDA's role is to mainly just oversee their strategy and assess the adequacy of the recall and classify it. So classifying it in 3 different categories. So you have class 1, which is going to be a very dangerous situation, so a dangerous or defective product that could cause serious health problems or death. Class 2 is a product that might cause a temporary health problem or pose a slight threat of serious nature. And then class 3 is your less severe, so something that basically isn't likely to cause any kind of health issue that usually violates something like FDA labeling or manufacturing laws. So we'll just kind of go into a little bit about each of these. So class 1, these are some of the least common, so around 10% of drug recalls. It's an emergency situation. So I give some examples here. So like a specific lot of a drug is found to contain a toxin that causes harm, or a labeled mix-up of 2 potent drugs would be an example. Class 2 recalls are going to be your most common that you see. Some examples that I give here are a specific lot of a drug is found to contain subpotent drug products. So not a dangerous situation, but over time that could lead to an issue. Maybe, let's say it's a blood pressure medicine, their blood pressure might not be controlled, which could lead to an issue over time. Another example I give is possibility of plastic particles in an injectable drug, which could block infusion and delay administration. So this one you could kind of edge on class 2 versus class 1, but this one it would be like you're preventing infusion. It's not going to like kill a patient depending on what the drug is, I guess. But if I give you guys like an example on your exam, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Like you'll know. So next one, class 3. This is going to be, again, around 10% of drug recalls, the least severe out of all of them. Some examples, a specific lot of a drug has a dye mix-up leading to different colored tablets. A drug label says 90 tablets instead of 30. None of that's going to hurt anybody. It's just more of they need to fix it. Okay. So here's some examples. Let's see if you guys can figure them out. So Amneal Pharmaceuticals recalled 7 lots of metformin tablets due to a possible human carcinogen NMDA found to be above the recommended limit of 0.096 micrograms. Class 1, raise your hand for class 1. Couple. Class 2. 4, 5, okay, thanks. Okay. Class 3. So that's a class 2. So, and it makes sense, because would you expect a carcinogen to cause an immediate health issue where it's going to kill you right then and there? No. Over time it could, so that's why it would be considered like a class 2. Does that make sense? Okay. Next example. Vista Pharmaceuticals has recalled a lot of hydrocodone solution due to the label specifying the drug as a C3 instead of a C2. Raise your hand for class 1, class 2, class 3. Yeah, that's an easy one. All right. And then the last one I have here, Fresenius Kabi has recalled a lot of dexmedetomidine, which is a sedative, which was found to have trace amounts of lidocaine, which is an anesthetic. Class 1. Okay. Class 2. Class 3. So this one's actually a class 1. So lidocaine, if you inject that into somebody, could be serious, especially mixed with dexmedetomidine, which is a sedative, could lead to them not being able to breathe. So this would be considered like an emergency situation to pull. I'm not going to give you something that's going to be very like, I don't know if that's class 1 or class 2. It'll be pretty serious if it was a class 1, or it will be pretty self-explanatory if it was a class 2 or a 3. All right. Non-prescription drugs. So now we're going and talking about the OTC market. So FDA does regulate non-prescription drugs to ensure that they are safe and effective for their intended use. And to bring a non-prescription drug to market, there are 2 regulatory pathways. And this can be a little confusing for some, so bear with me. So you have one of them, which is the new drug application, which you guys are like, well, didn't we talk about that with prescription? We'll get to that here in a second. You also have abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA. So the NDA is a direct to non-prescription or direct to OTC marketing drug. And then you have prescription to non-prescription switch. So basically a drug was previously a prescription drug, and now they're moving it to the OTC market. And I have some examples here. So you got Flonase nasal spray. That was previously only by prescription, and then they moved it into the OTC market. So they filed what's called an abbreviated NDA. Same with Nexium, was previously only prescription only. And then you have what's called the over-the-counter drug review, or OTC drug monograph process. So we're going to talk about each of these. So let's first talk about NDA and ANDA. So this is a process to bring a specific drug product, keyword, to the OTC market. So an example of like an NDA is a unique drug or drug delivery mechanism. So if you think of like Delsym syrup, which is dextromethorphan extended release syrup, this is a unique mechanism. So that specific company had to file an NDA to bring it to the OTC market. Another example I could think of would be like Advil liquid gels. That would be an example of a drug that had an NDA submitted. ANDA, like we talked about, is abbreviated, so they went from prescription to OTC. So your examples I give is Flonase, Nexium. And then the process for approval of a non-prescription drug using the NDA or ANDA pathway is identical to how we did prescription drugs. So you have to do all that stuff. You have to do your clinical trials, you have to do your NDA, your IND, your animal studies, all that stuff. The only main difference, though, between the OTC products is you have to incorporate what's called consumer behavioral studies. And what these do is they're looking at label comprehension, self-selection, actual use, and human factor studies. So basically, they just want to make sure that a patient, any general person in the population, could read this label and understand it and be able to use it properly, safely, and effectively. And so what do these studies look like? So I'll give you an example here. So let's say AB Pharmaceuticals wishes to bring this drug X into the OTC market. Their primary communication objective is ensuring the consumer understands the indication, dosing interval, contraindications, warnings, and drug interactions, when to stop. You have your secondary communication objectives. You got your design of your study with your exclusion criteria. Ultimately, they want to make sure they include a majority of the population. They don't want to exclude a bunch of people because you want to think about like who would be using this. Basically, any person off the street. The only like indication where maybe you would exclude someone would be someone that couldn't read English, for example. And then you would perform statistical analysis on all your data. But basically what they do is they create what's called like a questionnaire where they give the random individual a set of questions, and then they give the label of the drug, and the patient or the person has to be able to interpret the information and answer questions. So the wording, question structure, and sequences are very specific. So they recommend avoiding like 50-50 answers, multiple choice that leads to bias, so like talk to a doctor, avoid leading questions. Some example questions that they gave was Jennifer's son is 8 years old and weighs 52 pounds. According to the label, how many teaspoons should Jennifer give? John has diabetes and would like to take drug X. Is that okay or not okay? Given that that would be a yes or no answer, they then give you a follow-up open-ended question to eliminate correct answer due to chance. And then Joe developed a rash after taking drug X. What should he do? So just some examples. So basically they want to make sure that any individual would be able to interpret the information and be able to use it. Any questions on that? Okay. OTC drug monograph. So this can be a little confusing, but what it is in 1972, the FDA initiated what's called the OTC drug review, which allowed for OTC drugs to be marketed without a approved drug application under this specific section of the Act if it meets specific requirements. Basically meaning that manufacturers don't have to specifically market or bring a specific drug to market if it's already like established as being safe, effective to use. So that's why you have like a bunch of different like acetaminophen from like Costco and Walmart brand and all these others. They didn't have to like file an NDA to bring those to market. But it's a specific rule book for drugs that have specific therapeutic categories. So like antacids, sleep aids. And it requires the following to ensure the drug is generally recognized as safe and effective. So they have to have specific ingredients that are used for these specific indications at these doses, this route of administration, labeling, and testing. All that's required to be used when you're bringing that drug to market. Whenever the FDA created this specific monograph process, they placed drugs in 3 different categories. So you had category 1 drugs, which were drugs that are basically safe and effective. You had your category 2, which is not safe and effective. And then category 3 is we don't have enough information to determine that. The FDA only allows those drugs that are in category 1 to basically be brought to market. And you couldn't bring like a drug into the OTC monograph process if it was in category 2. But we'll talk more about this, but just bear with me. So let's say BC Pharmaceuticals wants to bring a new sleep aid to market using diphenhydramine. So this is not a novel concept. Benadryl has been on the market forever. We know it can be used for sleep. So the FDA does have an OTC monograph for diphenhydramine as a sleep aid. So the active ingredients, you have to make sure it's diphenhydramine hydrochloride. It must state it helps you fall asleep if you have difficulty falling asleep, or for relief of occasional sleeplessness, or helps to reduce difficulty falling asleep. Warnings must contain do not give to children under 12 years of age. The company has to follow all parts of the OTC monograph when submitting to the FDA. And then the way that they determine the specific categories or the monograph for these drugs is following this 3-phased approach. And we're not going to go into like tons of information on this, but basically just know that the FDA will bring together like a panel of individuals. They'll review the information and safety and efficacy data. They'll then create what's called an advance notice of what's called proposed rulemaking, or ANPR. The public comments on that. They then take it back, modify some things, bring back what's called the tentative final monograph, which is again open for public commentary. And then at that point, they create what's called the drug monograph. So the big issue with this process has been previously, like the FDA had a lot of different monographs they were reviewing at one point. So in 2016, this was a statement that was given by the FDA. They had 88 simultaneous rulemakings in 26 broad therapeutic categories and approximately 800 APIs for over 1,400 different therapeutic uses. Some of the drugs on the market were still in category 2 or 3. So basically you could have drugs that were already on the market that were in like category 2, which is not safe and effective, and just to think that there were drugs out there that we knew weren't safe and effective and we were still taking them, kind of crazy. The FDA basically had 18 employees that oversaw that entire market. And they also didn't require these manufacturers to submit any fees when they, wanted to bring a drug to market. So there was no funding for it. So a lot of issues there. So then the CARES Act, which you guys are probably like, wasn't that like the COVID stimulus bill? Well, that's how things sometimes get slipped in under the radar. But the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act, included statutory provisions that reform and modernize the way OTC monograph drugs are regulated in the U.S. So it replaced this rulemaking process with an administrative order process of issuing, revising, and amending OTC monographs. It also allowed for them to collect user fees dedicated to OTC monograph drug activities, and hopefully would expedite by providing additional resources so they can update these. Additionally, what the CARES Act did was it removed any drugs that were in the tentative final monograph that were category 2. They had to be removed from the market within 180 days of the CARES Act. But any drugs that were in category 1 or category 3 were allowed to remain. And then just wanted to also mention, can you guys guess, is there any drug that's on the market currently that's in, or OTC drug that's in category 3 currently? I was actually looking into this. I was kind of interested. There's actually a drug that's going into category 2 soon. But your sunscreens, it's like oxybenzone. I'm sure you guys have probably heard that there's been like reports of like potential skin cancer link to sunscreens, believe it or not. But those are technically right now in category 3, and there's actually been pushed to switch them into category 2. So you might hear something about that eventually, but just something interesting. Another one is, yeah.
I was going to ask where oral phenylephrine is.
That was the one I was going to bring up now. Yeah, so that one actually just got, so the FDA submitted the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, so the AMPR, on phenylephrine to move it to category 2. So the reason why they did that was they did efficacy studies on phenylephrine, and this was after it already got approved and has been on the market forever, but they found it wasn't effective. And so based on the studies they originally had reviewed, they found some flaws in the data. And so it's being moved to category 2. You still see it on the market because it hasn't gone through the entire process of getting like the tentative final monograph, and there has to be public commentary and all of that as well. But that's why you still find products that have phenylephrine in it. But once that officially gets finalized, if it stays category 2, then it will be removed. Yep.
Category 2 is where they put them if they're on the way out.
Correct. Yeah, so if it's not safe and effective, they get moved to what's called category 2. Just because something gets moved to category 2 doesn't mean that it automatically gets pulled. They still have to do like review of that, allow the public to comment on it, do further studies. They might modify potentially what they had reviewed for the efficacy data. I know it seems a little confusing, but basically if it was a drug that was already in category 2, and it was already in like the final monograph phase, like it got pulled already. So there's hardly any drugs that are in category 2 right now. Actually, there's none outside of phenylephrine that I'm aware of. And the only other ones that I found that were in category 3 was just the sunscreens. Everything else is either category 1 now.
Category 3
They're not sure. Well, there's not enough. Yeah, there's not enough data to make a claim that it's safe and effective. They just don't know yet, which I find that kind of hard to believe. We have sunscreens that have been out for decades. We still don't know. I don't, it just seems interesting to me. But other studies or other countries like Europe, they have lower percentages that they allow of these sunscreens. Some of them are actually even like not available in Europe because they've been linked to like cancer or whatever. So just thought I'd bring that up because I thought it was interesting. But anyways, the differences between the NDA and OTC monographs, I just kind of highlight the differences here. I'm not going to go over all these, but I think you guys get the point. It's more of just like you get more of like a product specific filing versus you're just bringing like a generic therapeutic category drug that's already established. Okay. All right. OTC drug facts label. So the labeling of OTC drugs has always contained usage and safety information for consumers. However, one of the biggest issues from like prior to the 90s was there was a lot of readability issues. So thinking of patients with like low health literacy or literacy skills in general, they would use words like indications, contraindications, precautions. I was scouring the internet last night, ended up finding this picture. This is a picture of an old aspirin bottle. You can see how like convoluted that entire
My parents' medicine that way.
yeah. But in here you could just see how like everything's just all like jumbled together, really hard to read.
Because older people generally can read very small.
Yeah. And then, so basically in 1999, they introduced what's called the OTC Drug Facts Label Regulation. It uses simple language, provides an easy to read format to help people compare and select OTC medications and follow dosage instructions. So here's an example of like what the label looks like now, so much cleaner, way easier to read and follow directions. So just important information to know. So next thing we are going to talk about is FDA when it oversees like drug advertisements. So specifically the FDA is overseeing our prescription drug advertisements, whether it's print or broadcast. Some of the rules that they require is like the drug cannot be like the advertisement cannot be false or misleading in any way. They have to make sure that they name the brand or generic of the drug and at least one FDA approved use for the drug and most significant risks of the drug. I have the Vytorin example that was like in the early 2000s, that was like all over TV. So, but basically the FDA is just overseeing any of your prescription drugs. All right. And then drug information. So this is also regulated by the FDA's Division of Drug Information. They provide timely, accurate, and useful information about human drug products through traditional social media channels. Consists of pharmacists and other healthcare professionals that provide education to the general public, small businesses, industry, and healthcare professionals. Did you guys ever hear of the sleepy chicken thing on TikTok where they would take chicken and put it in NyQuil and cook it? And evidently that was a trend for some reason. Anyways, FDA came out and said that that wasn't safe, of course. That's just an example of like the FDA is following social media channels, making sure that people are not doing things that are dangerous when it comes to drugs. Yes, sir. OTC drugs? Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second. Yeah, so prescription drugs are FDA. And then OTC, we're going to talk about as FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission. Okay. All right, so which OTC drug category includes drugs generally recognized as safe and effective? Yep, so category 1. All right, we finally made it through FDA. We're on slide 69. Okay, so next section we're going to talk about FTC. This is only like a couple slides. So the Federal Trade Commission This was created in 1914 to prevent unfair methods of competition. Protects consumers and competition by preventing anti-competitive, deceptive, and unfair business practices. When we think of their impact on like pharmacy, that includes things like the OTC drug advertisements. They also regulate pharmaceutical companies and pharmacies as far as antitrust concerns and merging. So specifically when I think it was Walgreens tried to buy Rite Aid, if you recall, there was a lot of issues with them merging together. FTC was involved with that. They also regulate pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. Going back to the OTC drug advertisements, which actually I'll talk about that next slide. I think I have some on that. Yeah. So OTC advertisements, 3 basic standards. Advertiser must have a prior substantiation that an objective claim in an ad is true. Advertisement must not be interpreted in any way to be misleading, including misrepresentations or omissions. The advertisements cannot cause substantial consumer harm in a way that is not outweighed by the competitive benefit or where the consumer could not reasonably avoid the harm. So an example, so this was FTC versus a AH Media Group. So they marketed a free trial product for younger licking skin or weight loss. The consumers paid, quote, a shipping and handling fee, but buried in the terms in small font and faded background text, the company would charge $90 for the trial product and enroll the consumer in a subscription plan. And consumers were awarded $5.4 million. Another example in recent times was, actually most recently was probably Prevagen. If you guys know of that, it's an OTC product that's been on the market for a while that's targeted for like memory health, and they did like studies. It's basically like it's derived from jellyfish, but would supposedly they did trials on this drug and found it like helped reduce like the risk of Alzheimer's and helped your memory. But FTC ended up like filing a lawsuit against that company saying that was not, they're not able to do that and make those claims, given the evidence that they were able to provide. So that drug ended up, it's still available, I believe, but they ended up having to change like the labeling in their claims. All right, that was FTC, so pretty quick. All right, Department of Justice, or DEA. So another little bit of history. So in the 1960s, there were 2 agencies that were charged with drug law enforcement. So we had the Bureau of Drug Abuse Control and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. In 1968, they merged to form what was called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, or BNDD. In the early 70s, there was a lack of coordination between different government agencies on controlled substances. So we had the BNDD, and then we had other entities like the U.S. Customs and other justice entities. And in 1973, President Nixon signed an executive order that created just one entity called the DEA. So prior to the 1960s, the use of drugs was not considered like acceptable behavior. And ultimately, America underwent like a pretty significant change after the 1960s when it started getting introduced into American culture. And efforts to normalize drug use started to take a terrible toll on the nation, with crime increasing between the 60s and 90s. You could see like the chart there where it was like how many overdose deaths we used to have back then. This is only in 1970, but today this only goes up to 2006, but the chart's just way too high. And another fact is in 1960, only 4 million Americans had ever tried drugs, but today 121 million Americans, which is about 37% of the US population. So that means that a third of you has tried something illegal or a drug. Yeah. But don't do drugs, kids. All right. So DEA's mission is to enforce the controlled substance laws and regulations of the United States. There's three separate divisions. So they have the Diversion Control Division, the Intelligence Division, and the Office of Forensic Sciences. The one that we're specifically going to focus on for medication safety is the Diversion Control Division, which regulates the manufacture and distribution of controlled pharmaceuticals and listed chemicals. And when we think of many of the problems when it comes to drug abuse in the United States, it's the result of legitimately made controlled substances being diverted from their lawful purpose into illicit drug traffic. So whether it's, you grab hydrocodone from your mom's medicine cabinet, or you're selling your Adderall tablets to your friend to study for an exam. Basically, the purpose of this division of the DEA is to prevent, detect, and investigate the diversion of controlled substances, ensuring adequate and uninterrupted supply for medical, commercial, and scientific needs. And they regulate businesses, health professionals, and pharmacies. All of those entities have to register with the DEA and comply with the regulatory requirements with drug security and record keeping. And that's why all of them have DEA numbers. So pharmacies have DEA numbers, prescribers have DEA numbers. Okay. So housed within the Diversion Control Division, they regulate a lot of different things. When I was thinking of what we should probably discuss when it comes to like medication safety, I thought about these four things, which we'll talk about. All right. So let's talk about the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, or CMEA. So what this was, it was introduced in 2006 to regulate the sale of pseudoephedrine, ephedrine, and phenylpropanolamine. And it created sales limits of pseudoephedrine and all of those products with a requirement of 3.6 grams in a one-day period, 9 grams in 30 days at the retail level, 7.5 grams in 30 days for mail order. Do you guys know Kentucky's? Does Kentucky have a different limit? Who's got the answer? I think they got rid of the yearly limit recently within the last couple of years, because it used to be 24 grams in a year. And I think they got rid of that, but there's still a monthly limit. Does anybody know? That's the law question. 7.2, yep. All right. And then the other thing that the CMEA requires is security of the product, appropriate record keeping, self-certification, and training of individuals that are selling these products. Another thing you guys might also be aware of if you worked in retail is NPLEX. This is a real-time electronic logging and compliance system used to track pseudoephedrine sales. It integrates with a pharmacy's point of sale platform and can be accessed utilizing a secure web portal. And it's linked with different state and local limits. They have a claim from like 2016 that said it had blocked 29 million grams of illegal pseudoephedrine sales. What I have pictured here is a map, specifically of states that utilize NPLEX. The red is where it's voluntary. The ones that are in gray, they either require a prescription for pseudoephedrine, ephedrine, et cetera, or they have no kind of like regulation whatsoever. Controlled substance schedules. So drugs that are considered controlled substances are divided into 5 schedules. And these are based on the current accepted medical use, relative abuse potential, likelihood of causing dependence when abused. Also, schedule of drugs can vary by state. So an example I give here is gabapentin, which if you go over in like Indiana, it's not controlled, but if you go over here in Kentucky, it's a C5. So just be aware that some controlled substances can vary depending on the state. You can't go backwards, so you can't take something that's a C1 and a state can't, for example, say cannabis is legal and legalize cannabis, whereas the federal government has it listed as a Schedule 1, but then now we're saying that it's unscheduled. You can't do that. but that's kind of another topic. But something that's kind of a lot of controversy lately. All right, so drug disposal. So prior to 2010, we basically only had one method of getting rid of controlled substances. So we only had local and state take-back programs, which these required. Basically, they had to register with the DEA, and then they also had to have a full-time law enforcement officer present during the take-back events. And ultimately, this was just kind of limited the available disposal options to the public. There's a big push to try to create more avenues to be able to get rid of prescription controlled substances. So this led to the Secure and Responsible Drug Disposal Act of 2010, which enabled more avenues for controlled substance disposal. Basically, it added two new things. So it allowed mail-back programs, so where you can mail your controlled substances back to the DEA or a reverse distributor to dispose of them. And then collection receptacles. So that's why you see these like medicine big boxes and like pharmacies. If you go on DEA's website, they do have an option where you can select to try to find like a collection receptacle, put in the zip code and how far away, and it'll give you all the different collection boxes. Another thing the Diversion Control Division is responsible for is reviewing what's called tips. So when we think of like our responsibility as like pharmacists, so we play a pretty crucial role when it comes to identifying unlawful distribution of controlled substances. So always be mindful when you're like out practicing, just making sure that you're looking at prescribing habits, filling patterns, individuals who are filling prescriptions. If you don't feel comfortable dispensing a specific drug or controlled substance because you don't think it's legitimate or it's not being used appropriately, definitely don't dispense it if you don't feel comfortable. Always think about your license and protecting your patients. The DEA, though, does allow for you to submit a tip and you can remain anonymous. They review these. They take action sometimes on prescribers, specifically from like pharmacists submitting information to them about like questionable providers or things they're finding. Okay. So which department of the federal government oversees the DEA? So most of you got it right. It is the Department of Justice. So Health and Human Services, that houses the FDA and CDC, which we are going to talk about CDC next. So role of the CDC. So it detects and responds to new and emerging health threats. They tackle the biggest health problems causing death and disability in Americans. They put science and advanced technology into action to prevent disease. They monitor the health of our nation. They develop leaders in training of the public health workforce. They promote healthy and safe behaviors as well. Again, reviewing all the things that they do, this is everything that I could find. Biggest one, though, when we think of like med safety, was vaccines. So the division of the CDC that's responsible for overseeing vaccines is the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases. They continuously update recommendations on vaccines and immunization schedules, specifically for children and adults, pregnancy, travel, and COVID-19 vaccines. All of the recommendations that they give come from a specific panel called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. So what is ACIP? So it comprises medical and public health experts to develop recommendations on how to use vaccines to control diseases in the U.S. So it consists of 14 experts and one consumer representative. And the information they review, they're always thinking about the safety and effectiveness of a vaccine for a specific age, the severity of disease, how many people would get the disease if there was no vaccine, how practical recommendations are put into practice. They hold 3 regular meetings each year, so February, June, and October. And this can lead to some specific vaccines not getting, so let's say like a vaccine comes to market, it might not get a recommendation by the ACIP for several months. So you might hear about a new vaccine getting approved, but then it could take several months for it to end up becoming in the schedule and recommended by the CDC. So, and insurances usually won't cover it until it's actually like recommended. So vaccine information statements. So the story behind this, this was the result of a lawsuit between Rees and Wyeth Laboratories, where a child developed polio after receiving an oral polio vaccine. And the court ended up ruling against the manufacturer, saying that they were responsible for warning patients about risks of vaccines. This led to a lot of concern, where manufacturers started increasing prices of their vaccines, because obviously the liability involved with that would just lead to astronomical amounts of lawsuits and a lot of liability in general for them. So the CDC ended up deciding that they would assume responsibility for warning patients about the risks before they get a vaccine. So they added the duty to warn clause for CDC vaccine purchase contracts, and led to the development of the VIS, or Vaccine Information Statement. So this is a document that is produced by the CDC that informs vaccine recipients about the benefits and risks of a vaccine. It has to be given prior to administering the vaccine. There's multiple different ways the patients can get it. So they can get paper copies, permanent or laminated copies, or electronically. However, if you give anything other than paper, so if you have like the laminated copy, you have to still offer that to the patient and be able to give it. That's why we still have like paper copies at retail pharmacies to be able to hand out to patients. And here's just an example of what a VIS statement or vaccine information statement looks like. This is specifically for the Tdap vaccine. Another thing to also make sure you're aware of when you're practicing is the date, specifically for the VIS. So it gets updated periodically. So making sure that you're using the most up-to-date VIS. And we're going to quickly go through state government because I think we're running out of time here. So next one we have is governor. So this is state government. So the role of the governor in medication safety is they sign laws and statutes passed by the state legislature. They also issue executive orders that typically involve times of like medication access concerns due to unrest or natural disasters. So example that I had was like the Kentucky flooding this year, and then there was a couple years ago, but basically Andy Beshear signed an executive order allowing basically 30-day supplies to be emergency fills by a pharmacist, even if they didn't have refills of the drug. You can see like where these executive orders are on the governor's website, and then past ones in their governor's journal, and I give you instructions of how to do that. I'm not going to ask you how to do that on the exam. It's just more for your reference. But then lastly, Board of Pharmacy. So the state legislators, they pass laws or statutes that govern the practice of pharmacy under what's called a Pharmacy Practice Act, or PPA. It gives the Board of Pharmacy the authority to develop state laws or board rules. The mission of the Kentucky Board of Pharmacy, they basically promote, preserve, protect the public health, safety, welfare through regulation of the practice of pharmacy. They ultimately examine, test, credential pharmacists, regulate and practice pharmacy, and then discipline. So PDMP, so states also regulate the prescription drug monitoring programs, which track controlled substance prescriptions in a state. Before what was called the Support Act, there was actually no law that required states to have a PDMP. So you might have heard of like controlled substance shopping in like Florida and all that stuff that happened several years ago. But now with the requirement of having a PDMP, it allows pharmacists and prescribers to make sure that patients aren't getting controlled substances through illegitimate means. The state PDMP for Kentucky is Casper, and then for Indiana is Inspect. That's it. Any questions? Okay. I did have there's a couple other things. I have a Jeopardy game. Dr. Malcolm, I believe, is going to post the presentation slides for you guys if he hasn't already. It'll have this on there, but I just made a few questions if you guys wanted to like get some additional, possible questions that might come up. I also had written a case. I don't know what he's going to do about that if he wants to not worry about that. Okay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Anyways, you guys are free. Thank you so much.
I'm going to post a quick evaluation for Dr. Ehringer that's